The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to a mound of dull orange embers, casting long, wavering shadows across the lime-washed walls of the cottage. Outside, the late autumn wind picked at the thatch, carrying with it the sharp, damp smell of rotting oak leaves and the bitter cold rolling down from the ironwood ridges to the north. Mara sat at her heavy pine workbench, her lower back throbbing with a deep, dull ache that had not eased since noon. Her hands, stained dark around the fingernails with the juices of ground yarrow and dried feverfew, worked the basalt pestle against the stone mortar with a slow, rhythmic scraping sound. It was the only noise in the small room, save for the steady click of her own breath and the subtle shift of the heavy life carried beneath her ribs. She was 9 months pregnant. Her body felt large, cumbersome, and intensely foreign, the swell of her belly pressing hard against the linen of her smock whenever she leaned forward. Her bag sat beside the heavy oak door. It had sat there for 6 weeks, fully packed and rechecked every 3 days. Inside were 3 hanks of dried salt beef, 2 pairs of thick woolen stockings, a roll of clean linen bandages, an iron knife with a bone handle, 42 silver shillings wrapped in greasy flannel, and 3 vials of dark glass containing concentrated poppy syrup. Behind the cottage, in the small lean-to shed sheltered from the wind, her old gray gelding stood saddled under a oilskin tarp, his feed bag half full. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. If a rider came from the north, if a shadow crossed her threshold that bore the cold, fluid stillness of the reach, she would not argue. She would not scream. She would leave through the kitchen door, take the forest trail through the Black Ravine, and be across the river Ouse into the southern kingdoms before the sun cleared the eastern hills. She knew what elven law dictated. She had read it in the stolen, yellowed vellum scrolls she had hidden beneath her floorboards when she was 14 years old. Any child bearing the blood of the firstborn, conceived outside the high sanctum of the Reach, is the sole property of the crown, to be rendered unto the court upon its first breath. They would take her child. They would raise it in halls of cold blue stone, beneath lanterns of bottled starlight, surrounded by ancient beings who looked upon human mothers the way a scholar looked upon the temporary bloom of a wild orchid, curious, fleeting, and entirely disposable. Mara pressed her palm against the side of her belly as the child kicked, a sharp, hard jab against her ribs that made her catch her breath. "Patience," she whispered to the quiet room. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears. Just a few days more. Then, the forest went quiet. It was not a gradual settling of the night. It was an abrupt, absolute violence of silence. The wind did not drop. It simply ceased to exist. The rustle of the dry oak leaves outside stopped mid-shake. The crickets in the stone wall, which had been chirping their ragged late autumn song all evening, went instantly mute. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to lose its hiss, the flames freezing into licking ribbons of orange light. Mara stopped her arm mid-stroke. The stone pestle hovered an inch above the mortar. A low, resonant frequency vibrated in the back of her jaw. It was not a sound heard through the ears, but a tremor felt in the bone. A hum like the deep, vibrating release of a heavy bowstring drawn and held under immense tension. The temperature inside the cottage dropped 10 degrees in 5 seconds. Her breath bloomed into a pale gray cloud in front of her face. She did not reach for her bag by the door. She did not run for the kitchen hatch. Slowly, carefully, pushing off the edge of the heavy oak table with both hands, Mara stood up. Her feet were swollen inside her leather boots, her knees stiff. She smoothed the front of her apron smock over the high, hard mound of her stomach, shifted her weight, and walked across the wide pine floorboards toward the front entrance. She did not hesitate. She unlatched the iron bolt and pulled the door inward before he could knock. He was not on her doorstep. He stood at the far edge of the clearing, 40 feet away, right where the dark line of the ironwood forest yielded to her overgrown garden patch. He stood among the withered stalks of her late summer cabbage and dry tansy, motionless as a carved monument of pale stone. The moonlight caught his hair first, long, straight, silver white, falling loose over his shoulders and contrasting sharply with the heavy, dark velvet of his traveling cloak. He wore no armor. He carried no visible weapon, yet the air around him hummed with the sheer, oppressive weight of his presence, static electricity prickling against Mara's arms and making the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Caelindor, High King of the Elven Reach, called the Silver King by men and the Hollow King by his own people, looked at her across the frost-dusted grass. His pale gold eyes, faintly luminescent in the gloom of the forest edge, found her face first. For a long, terrifying second, his expression was completely void, the smooth, unreadable mask of an immortal who had watched 300 years of human generations turn to dust without lifting an eyebrow. Then, slowly, his gaze dropped. It rested on her waist, on the dramatic, unmistakable curve of her heavy body beneath the rough gray wool of her dress. The High King went utterly, terrifyingly still. The faint aura of light around his shoulders flickered once, like a candle caught in a draught, before vanishing into the dark. Mara leaned her weight against the doorframe, her hand resting heavily on her stomach, feeling the child move again within her, hard and restless, as if sensing the cold current that had just swept across the yard. "You took your time," she said. 8 months earlier, the village of Ashford had smelled of dying cattle and damp earth. It had begun in the late winter, before the snows had fully cleared from the low pastures. First, the milk cows stopped eating, their hides turning dull and dry like old parchment. Then the plow oxen began to bleed from their gums, their tongues swelling until they could no longer swallow water. It was not a rot that touched men. No human child fell ill, no elder took to their bed. But within 4 weeks, half the livestock in the border settlement lay dead in the mud, their bellies bloated and cold. Without oxen, the fields could not be turned. Without cows, the spring infants would starve on watered barley porridge. Mara had tried everything she knew. She had boiled willow bark and garlic. She had drenched the beasts with copperas and vinegar. She had burned dried toad flax in the barns to drive out foul air. Nothing worked. By the 3rd week of the thaw, the village elder, Coarse, a man whose spine had cured into a C shape from 60 years of pulling weeds, stood in her small kitchen with his rough hands trembling against his wooden staff. "There is Silverbell in the Reach," Coarse had said, his voice smelling of dry oats and despair. "My grandfather told of it. The elves planted along their garden walkways to keep the soil sweet. A pinch of the dried root in the trough clears the blood rot in a night." "The Reach is closed, Coarse," Mara had replied, setting down her shears. "You know the law. No human crosses the border posts without a royal writ." "I sent a petition 3 months back." Coarse spat onto her stone floor, then hastily rubbed it out with the toe of his boot. "Sent it with the timber merchant to the border post at Oakhaven." The guards took the silver penny and threw the parchment in the river. "They do not care if we eat our own boots come winter, Mara. To them, we are mice nesting in the thatch of their barn." Mara had said nothing more to the old man that afternoon. But that night, after the village had gone dark and the only light left was the cold blue moon hanging over the ironwood ridge, she had packed her leather satchel. She did not take weapons. She took 3 iron herb knives, a ball of oiled twine, 2 square yards of waxed canvas, and a small leather-bound primer written in an archaic flowing script that she had bartered from a dying mercenary 7 years ago in exchange for curing his gangrenous toe. No one in Ashford knew she could read the script. No one knew that for 10 years, while the rest of the village slept, Mara had sat by her hearth, copying out the intricate, looped characters of the High Elvish tongue, repeating the soft, liquid vowels under her breath until her tongue lost its heavy human clack. She was not a scholar. She was simply curious, driven by a deep, quiet hunger to know what lay beyond the dark wall of trees that bounded her small, muddy world. She crossed the border at midnight. The boundary between human land and the elven reach was not a wall or a fence. It was a line where the forest changed its nature. On the human side, the woods were wild, messy, and tangled with brambles and fallen, rotting birch. On the elven side, the trees grew tall, straight, and impossibly far apart, their pale silver bark smooth as polished bone, the floor beneath them covered in a thick carpet of soft, luminous moss that swallowed the sound of her footfalls completely. She had been inside the reach for less than an hour when the air temperature plummeted. Mara stopped in a small glade where 3 ancient silver oaks intertwined their branches. The moon was bright above the canopy, casting sharp, blue-white light through the leaves. She pulled her wool cloak tighter around her throat, her thumb slipping into the leather pocket where her small iron knife lay. There was no sound of a footstep, no snapping twig. One moment the glade was empty. The next, a figure sat atop the low stone outcropping 10 feet away, watching her. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, his body wrapped in a high-collared tunic of dark, seamless wool that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. His hair was the pale silver of frost on water, falling straight to his shoulder blades, and his eyes, even in the shadow of the trees, glowed with a faint, steady topaz light. Mara froze. Every instinct she possessed, honed by 24 years of surviving in a hard border village, told her to drop her head, drop to her knees, and make herself as small as the dirt. The Elf King did not move. He sat with one long leg drawn up, a hand resting casually on his knee. His face was a masterpiece of cold, symmetrical stone, beautiful in a way that made her ribs ache, but entirely devoid of human mercy. "You are 20 miles past the border stone, human," he said. His voice did not ring out. It was low, quiet, and carried a strange, double-layered resonance, as if 2 voices were speaking in unison, one near her ear and the other deep underground. He spoke in the trade tongue of the border, his human words pronounced with absolute, immaculate precision. Mara took a slow, steady breath through her nose. She felt the cold moss beneath her boots. She felt the heavy leather strap of her satchel cutting into her shoulder. "I know," she said. She did not use the human trade tongue. She used the formal, archaic High Elvish of the Southern Reach, the dialect reserved for royal courts and sacred texts. "I have come for the silver bell root," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her knees. "The cattle in Ashford are dying of the blood blight. Without them, 20 families will starve before the autumn wheat can be sown." The Silver King did not jump. He did not gasp. But the faint, luminous glow of his gold eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter. The casual, lazy grace of his posture dissolved instantly into a tight, sharp alertness. He leaned forward. The movement was so fast it blurred. 1 second he was on the rock, the next he stood 5 feet in front of her, his tall frame blocking out the moon. The cold radiating off him was like standing before an open cellar door in midwinter. "Where did a wild human girl learn the tongue of the first house?" he asked. He was no longer using the trade language. He was speaking High Elvish, his tone sharp, metallic, and dangerous. "From a book," Mara replied directly, refusing to step back even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "And from 7 years of practice when the rest of my village was asleep. My name is Mara. I am the healer of Ashford. I do not want your land, King. I do not want your silver. I want 6 ounces of dried silver bell root, and then I will leave your woods and never return." Caelindor looked down at her for a long, silent moment. His gaze was searching, heavy and cold, stripped of all emotion. He looked at her muddy boots, her coarse wool skirt, her dark auburn hair pulled back in a fraying, practical braid, and finally at her gold-flecked hazel eyes. "Show me your satchel," he said quietly. She unslung the satchel and held it out with both hands. He did not touch the bag directly. Instead, he extended one long, pale finger and tipped the flap open. His nail was neatly trimmed, clean, and bore the faint blue tint of elven blood beneath the skin. He inspected her tools, the iron shears, the bone needle, the small jars of hog lard and tallow, the dried sprigs of thyme. Simple, crude, human things. "Silverbell does not work if it is simply pulled from the earth," Caelindor said, his voice returning to that flat, unreadable tone. "If a human harvests it, the magic in the sap curdles within an hour. It becomes poison." Mara's heart sank. She felt the cold seep into her boots. "Then teach me how to pull it." "I cannot," Caelindor said. He turned his back on her, his long cloak sweeping over the moss without making a sound. "It requires 3 weeks of preparation in basalt vats, infused with the resonance of the court, or it is useless." He stopped and looked back at her over his shoulder. His pale gold eyes held hers in the dim light. "If you wish to save your cattle, healer," he said, "you will have to come with me." The palace of the High King was not built of wood or brick. It was carved directly into the living granite of the Great Reach, a towering labyrinth of slender spires, vaulted archways, and subterranean halls that smelled faintly of white pine, ancient dust, and cold iron. For 3 weeks, Mara lived in a small, square room set into the eastern tower. It was sparse, a bed of polished stone covered in thick, dark wool blankets, a low wooden table, and a narrow arched window that looked out over the endless, mist-shrouded canopy of the ironwood forest. The air in the palace was always cold, maintaining a sharp, autumnal crispness that never varied whether the sun was shining or the night was black. The court was horrified by her presence. Mara saw them during her daily walks to the lower gardens where the silverbell was cultivated. They were magnificent, terrifying creatures, tall, slender, with skin like ivory and eyes that burned with faint, colored light. They moved through the grand corridors like ghosts, their fine silk robes whispering against the flagstones, their voices hushed into soft, musical whispers whenever she passed. They did not speak to her. They looked through her, as if she were a mild stain on the floorboards that would eventually be scrubbed away. All except Lord Eravast. On her 4th day, as she sat near the lower vats watching the silverbell roots soak in the clear, mineral-rich water, Eravast had appeared. He was old, even for an elf, with hair the color of tarnished pewter and lines of deep, bitter pride etched around his thin mouth. "It is an insult," Eravast had said, speaking in High Elvish as if testing whether the rumors of her tongue were true. He stood 3 feet away, his hands tucked into the wide sleeves of his embroidered mantle, refusing to look directly at her face. "The king brings a human stray into the inner ring to prepare a common weed. It undermines the dignity of the throne." Mara had not stopped her work. She was scraping the fine white bark off a root using a small silver knife Caelindor had provided. The common weed is the only thing keeping 50 human children from starving this winter, Lord Aravast, she said without looking up. And if my presence offends your dignity, you are welcome to close your eyes when you walk down this corridor. Aravast's breath had hitched, a sharp hiss of air through his teeth. You speak with great insolence for a creature whose life spans the bloom of a single rose. And you carry great arrogance for someone who has lived 1,000 years without learning how to cure a simple calf rot, Mara replied coolly. Before Aravast could answer, a voice had echoed down the stone hallway, low, smooth, and carrying the weight of absolute authority. Leave us, Aravast. Caelindor stood at the top of the stairwell. He wore his dark formal tunic, his silver hair bound back with a narrow band of dark iron. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but Aravast had bowed instantly, a stiff, angry jerk of his head, and retreated down the gallery without another word. Caelindor walked down the steps, his long, fluid strides noiseless against the basalt floor. He stopped beside her workbench, looking down at the neat pile of scraped roots. "You should not provoke him," the king said softly. "Aravast remembers the human wars. He does not view your kind with favor." "I don't need his favor," Mara said, setting down the knife and rubbing her stiff fingers. "I need this root to steep for 6 more days without your court lords spilling draft poison into the vats." Caelindor was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched the pile of root shavings she had cleared away. His long finger moved with delicate precision, sorting the thick bark from the thin skin. "You are doing it incorrectly," he said. "I am following the instructions in the text," she countered, pointing to the open scroll beside her. The text was written by a human scholar 600 years ago who only observed the process from 30 yards away, Caelindor said. He took the silver knife from her hand. His fingers were ice cold, his skin smooth as polished bone, but when his hand brushed hers, a sudden, sharp prickle of warmth, like static electricity on a dry winter day, zapped across her skin. Mara drew her hand back slightly. Caelindor did not notice, or chose not to show it. He took a fresh silver bell root, held it between 2 fingers, and applied a gentle rolling pressure along its spine before making a single, shallow cut. "If you strip the outer bark completely," he said, his voice dropping into a low instruction, "you release the volatile oils too quickly. It must be scored, not skinned. The magic resides in the inner vein, not the meat." Mara watched his hands. They were large, powerful hands, capable of wielding the heavy longswords she had seen hanging in the royal armory. Yet he handled the delicate plant with extraordinary tenderness. "Why do you patrol the border yourself?" she asked suddenly. The knife stopped. Caelindor did not look up from the root. "What?" "The night I was caught," Mara said, leaning her elbows on the stone table. "You are the High King. You have 300 border guards stationed at Oakhaven alone. Why were you walking the Ironwood Ridge at midnight by yourself?" Caelindor was quiet for so long that Mara thought he would simply ignore the question, as he often did when she asked about the workings of his realm. He made another precise score down the length of the silver bell root, the faint blue light of his magic glowing softly around his knuckles. "Because the palace is very quiet," he said at last. The words were simple, but they landed in the cold room with the weight of an anvil. Over the next 2 weeks, a quiet, unspoken rhythm formed between them. Every evening, after the court had retired to their private quarters and the great stone galleries grew dark, Caelindor would come to the eastern tower. He did not bring attendants. He did not wear his royal robes. He came in a simple tunic of dark gray wool, bringing a tray with small silver pots of roasted bitter tea and thin cakes made of hazelnut flour. They sat at the small wooden table by the window. They spoke in fragments. Mara told him about Ashford, about the blacksmith who had lost 3 fingers to an iron grate but could still shoe a horse better than any man in the province, about the grain miller, Bren, whose wife had died of the lung fever 5 years ago, and who still left fresh-baked white bread on Mara's windowsill every Sunday morning without saying a word. About the tedious, exhausting work of boiling willow bark and stitching torn skin. Caelindor listened. He listened with an intensity that Mara found disquieting. He did not interrupt. He did not offer royal platitudes. He simply sat with his pale gold eyes fixed on her face, drinking his dark tea, absorbing every mundane detail of human suffering and survival as if it were a rare history of a forgotten kingdom. In turn, she asked him about the Reach. "Is it true your sky looks different from ours?" she asked one night, leaning her chin in her hand as she watched the stars through the narrow window. Caelindor looked out into the blackness. "It is the same sky," he said softly. "The same sun, the same moon. But our eyes perceive the faint strands of the ley, the blue light that flows between the mountains. It makes the night look crowded." "Show me," she said. He looked at her, startled. "I cannot grant you elven sight, Mara." "Then describe it," she said flatly. "Use your words. You have 1,400 years of vocabulary. Surely you can describe a sky." A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch caught the corner of Caelindor's mouth. It was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on his face. He spent the next hour doing just that. He spoke of rivers of pale indigo light that wound around the stars like silver threads, of great, slow-moving eddies of gold magic that gathered over the deep mountain valleys like glowing fog, of how the moon did not merely reflect light, but drank it from the earth and spat it back out in subtle ribbons of violet. He spoke with a quiet, poetic precision that filled the small stone room, his voice humming in the cold air, until Mara felt as though she were floating in the middle of that strange, luminous sky herself. She realized then, with a quiet shock that made her stomach tighten, that he was not cold because he was empty. He was cold because he was keeping everything inside. Centuries of memory, sorrow, and terrifying isolation, locked behind a wall of ancient basalt. The turning point came on the 18th night. Mara had been searching for an extra roll of linen tape in the lower archives, a vast vaulted library beneath the palace that smelled of old calfskin, cedar oil, and dry dust. She had taken a small oil lamp, her soft leather slippers making no sound on the flagstones. She found him in the deepest alcove, sitting on a stone bench beneath a high, narrow window. He was holding a piece of parchment. It was yellowed, brittle at the edges, and bore a dark, dried stain along the bottom margin. He was not reading it. He was merely staring at it, his thumb tracing the faded line of text over and over again, his pale face drawn into an expression of such profound, crushing grief that Mara instinctively took a step back, her heart leaping into her throat. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot. Caelindor did not look up, but his fingers went instantly still against the vellum. "It is 300 years old," he said quietly. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual smooth resonance. Mara stayed where she was, holding her lamp low so the light would not strike his eyes. "You shouldn't be down here in the cold," she said softly. "I am always cold, Mara," he replied. He looked at the parchment for a moment longer, then slowly folded it along its worn creases and slipped it into the inner breast pocket of his tunic, right over his heart. "Go back to your room," he said, though there was no heat in the command, only a flat, hollow exhaustion. "The silver bell will be fully steeped by dawn. You will be able to return to your village tomorrow." Mara did not leave. She set her lamp down on a nearby reading desk, walked across the cold stone floor, and sat down on the bench beside him. She did not touch him. She simply sat there, her shoulder an inch away from his, sharing the freezing air of the vault. "In Ashford," Mara said quietly, looking at the dark stone wall opposite them. "When someone dies, we burn pine needles in the hearth for 7 days. It leaves a scent in the house, a reminder that something lived there, even if the room is empty now." Caelindor looked at her. His gold eyes were dark, shadowed with centuries of unexpressed pain. "What if the room has been empty for 300 years? He asked, his voice barely a breath. Mara turned her head and looked into his face, at the sharp jaw, the pale, smooth skin, the terrifyingly beautiful eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. "Then you stop sitting in the dark," she said, "and you let someone build a fire." The 20th night was their last night. The silver bell route was finished. 6 sealed clay jars sat on the table in Mara's room, packed securely in wet moss and wrapped in oiled cloth, ready to be strapped to a pack mule. Her task was done. Ashford's cattle would be saved. Neither of them mentioned her departure during dinner. Caelindor had brought the meal to the archive room, his choice, away from the sharp eyes and whispering mouths of his court. They sat before a small, contained fire he had lit in the iron grate, a rare indulgence in the palace, where heat was usually considered unnecessary. The firelight cast long, orange flickers over his pale skin, softening the sharp edges of his jaw and turning his silver hair to molten gold. "You will return to your plants," Caelindor said, setting his empty teacup down on the stone hearth. "I will," Mara said, staring into the flames. "The spring fever will be coming next month. The village children always get the lung cough when the snow melts." "They are fortunate to have you." "They have me because I have nowhere else to go," she said plainly. She looked up at him. "And you? What will you do when I am gone?" "I will rule," Caelindor said. "I will sign the timber treaties with the Western Duchies. I will hold court on Tuesdays. I will walk the border." "And the archive?" she asked softly. "Will you sit in the dark alcove?" Caelindor was silent for a long moment. He looked at his long, pale hands resting on his knees. "I had forgotten what it was like," he said, his voice dropping into that quiet, double-layered register that sent shivers down her spine. To speak without weighing every word for political treason. To be looked at without fear or reverence. He raised his eyes to hers. The pale gold light within them was steady, warm, and intensely focused. "You look at me as if I am merely a man, Mara." "You are merely a man," Mara said, though her breath hitched in her throat as he shifted closer to her on the bench. "A very old, very tall man with too many laws and too much stone, but a man nonetheless." Caelindor reached out. His movement was slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away. His long, cold fingers brushed against her cheek, tracing the line of her jawline down to her neck. Where his skin touched hers, that strange static warmth flared. Not cold at all, but a deep, subterranean heat that made her pulse leap into her throat. Mara did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second as his thumb smoothed over her cheekbone. "Mara," he whispered. She opened her eyes. He was very close now. She could smell the scent of him: white pine, ironwood frost, and something ancient and clean like high mountain air. "I am a human," she reminded him, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the wood fire. "I have 50 years left if I am lucky. I will grow old and fat and gray. My hands will get stiff with gout, and I will die in a small wooden house that smells of sheep dip." "I know," Caelindor said. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It was not a king taking what he wished. It was a starving man touching water for the first time in 300 years. His lips were surprisingly soft, cool at first, but warming instantly as his breath mingled with hers. Mara's hands found their way to his shoulders, her fingers gripping the thick wool of his tunic, pulling him closer as the world outside the archive room dissolved into nothingness. The cold stone floor, the ancient laws, the court lords, the dying cattle, all of it burned away in the quiet, overwhelming heat that flared between them. He moved with an extraordinary, restrained gentleness, his large hands cradling her face as if she were made of thin glass, his breath shuddering against her throat as he pulled her onto his lap. When he laid her down on the thick woolen blankets before the hearth, his pale gold eyes were dark, liquid, and entirely open. There was no king left in the room, only a man who had finally let the fire burn through his ice. Mara gave herself to him completely, her fingers tangled in his long silver hair, her body arching into his cold, firm strength, until the distinction between human and elf, mortal and immortal, vanished entirely into the dark. She left at dawn. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern spires of the Reach when Mara stood beside her packed bags in the small eastern tower room. The morning air was bitter cold, frosting the small diamond panes of the arched window. Caelindor was still asleep in the small bed, or rather, resting in the deep, silent trance of his kind. His face was relaxed, the hard lines of his brow smoothed away, looking younger than she had ever seen him. Mara stood beside the bed for a long time, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. She knew the truth. She was not stupid. A human girl from a border village could not stay in the high court of the Elven Reach. Edivast and his faction would see her destroyed or humiliated. Caelindor would be forced to choose between his kingdom's stability and a mortal mistress who would wither and die before his eyes in the blink of an elven eye. She took a small piece of parchment from the table, a scrap left over from her herb notes. She dipped a quill in dark oak gall ink and wrote 3 words in High Elvish. She laid the scrap on the pillow beside his silver hair, picked up her heavy bags of silverbell root, and walked out of the palace before the court awoke. The return to Ashford was quiet. She used the silverbell root. It worked precisely as Caelindor had said. She boiled the scored veins in iron kettles, poured the concentrated tea into the village troughs, and within 3 days, the blood blight broke. The cattle began to eat. The oxen stood up in their stalls. The village was saved. Mara returned to her daily life. She ground herbs. She stitched wounds. She delivered the tailor's 3rd child. She told no one where she had been. When Bren asked her how she had obtained the root, she simply said she had traded with a border merchant at the River Ouse. Bren had looked at her with his quiet, protective brown eyes, nodded once, and never asked again. 2 months after her return, Mara woke up at dawn with her stomach churning violently. She sat over her wooden slop bucket for 20 minutes, heaving until her ribs ached. At first, she thought it was the spring fever. But 3 weeks later, when her monthly bleeding failed to arrive for the 2nd time, and her breasts grew heavy and tender to the touch, she knew. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, her hand resting flat against her lower stomach. A child, a child carrying the blood of the Silver King. Terror, cold, sharp, and absolute, swept through her. She knew elven law. She had read the ancient scrolls. Any child bearing the blood of the firstborn, born outside the court, is the sole property of the crown. If Aravast found out, if the court discovered that a human healer in a border village was carrying a royal bastard, they would not merely take the baby, they would execute her for treason against the bloodline, or drag her back to the Reach to spend her life locked in a stone cell as an incubator for an elven heir. She could not write to Caelindor. A letter carried by human messengers would be intercepted by Aravast's guards before it reached the border. She made her plan. She would stay in Ashford until the baby was born. She would keep her smocks loose. She would avoid the border posts. And the moment she gave birth, she would take her child and flee south, far beyond the reach of the Ironwood Forest, where no elf had walked in 1,000 years. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she was protecting her baby. She refused to allow herself to wonder if Caelindor had found the scrap of parchment she had left on his pillow. She refused to allow herself to hope that he had cared enough to read it. Now, 9 months later, the Silver King stood in her yard among the dead cabbage stalks. The silence between them was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the damp earth. Caelindor took a step forward. It was not the smooth, terrifyingly fluid stride of an elven monarch. It was a slow, hesitant step, the movement of a man who was afraid that if he moved too fast, the vision before him would shatter like thin ice. He stopped 6 feet from her doorstep. The cold radiating off him was immense, but beneath it, Mara felt that same low, humming resonance, a vibration that rattled the small bones of her inner ear and made the baby in her womb turn hard against her side. "Mara," he said. His voice was different. The cold, polished composure was gone. It was flat, dry, and thick with an exhaustion so deep it seemed to be carved into his very frame. "You are 4 months late," Mara said again, her voice holding firm despite the wild pounding of her heart. "I did not know," Caelindor said quietly. He did not look at her eyes. His pale gold gaze remained locked on the heavy swell of her belly beneath her apron. "I felt something. On the morning you left, I woke and felt a cord had been pulled tight inside my chest. A low hum. I thought it was grief." He took another half-step closer. He was so tall he blocked out the moon completely, casting her in his long shadow. "It took 5 months for the child's magic to grow strong enough to cross the border veil," he said, his voice dropping into a rough whisper. 5 months before I understood that the hum was not a memory. It was a heartbeat. Mara's hand tightened over her stomach. "Elven law, do not speak to me of elven law," Caelindor cut her off. There was a sudden, sharp flash of authority in his tone, the old king surging forward, before it vanished back into raw vulnerability. "I wrote the law, Mara. 300 years ago, I wrote every word of it." He reached inside his dark velvet cloak. His long, pale fingers pulled out a small, crumpled piece of parchment, yellowed, thumb-worn, and creased as if it had been folded and unfolded 10,000 times. He held it out to her. Written in dark oak gall ink, in her own practical, looped handwriting, were 3 words in High Elvish. "Navanta lost. Do not forget me." "I did not forget," Caelindor said softly, his pale gold eyes meeting hers in the dark. "I have not slept in 4 months." Before Mara could answer, a loud thud rang out from the side of the cottage. A heavy birch log hit the damp grass, followed by the sound of a man catching his breath in a sharp gasp. Bren stood at the corner of the house, a massive stack of firewood balanced in his arms, his mouth wide open. He was staring at Caelindor, at the impossibly tall, silver-haired figure in dark velvet whose eyes glowed faintly in the gloom. Bren's hand slipped, and 3 more logs tumbled into the mud. "Mara," Bren choked out, his hand instinctively dropping to the small hunting knife at his belt. "Mara, get behind me." Mara looked at Bren, at her neighbor, who had brought her soup when she had the fever, who had left fresh bread on her window, who had asked no questions when her belly began to swell 6 months ago. Then she looked at Caelindor. The king had turned his head slightly, watching the human miller with a cold, detached curiosity, his frame completely still. "It's all right, Bren," Mara said, her voice gentle in the crisp night air. "He's a friend." Caelindor's pale eyes snapped back to Mara's face at the word. He said nothing. He simply stood there, 6 feet 7 inches of ancient elven majesty, letting a muddy human miller look at him as if he were an invading army. "A friend?" Bren repeated, his voice high and strained. "Mara, that's the Silver King. Lord above, that's the King of the Reach."
"I know who he is, Bren," Mara said softly, stepping down off her threshold onto the cold grass. "Please, go back to the mill. I am safe." Bren looked between Mara's heavy, tired body and the towering monarch standing in her cabbage patch. He looked terrified, confused, and fiercely protective. "If you need me," Bren said, pointing a thick, calloused finger at Caelindor. "I'm 50 yards down the track. I have the iron pitchfork." Caelindor did not laugh. He did not mock the human. He gave Bren a single, slow, formal bow of his head, a gesture of respect from the High King of the Reach to a miller with a wooden knife. Bren swallowed hard, backed away slowly, and then turned and ran down the dark path toward the mill. Mara did not invite him inside. She sat on the low wooden bench on her front porch, wrapped in her thickest wool blanket, a warm stone wrapped in flannel resting against her aching lower back. Caelindor did not ask to enter. He sat on the rough pine step 4 feet below her, his long legs drawn up, his dark velvet cloak spread around him like a pool of shadows. She had brought him a mug of roasted birch bark tea. He held it in his long, pale hands, the steam rising between his fingers, though he did not drink. He seemed content simply to feel the heat radiating off the clay. The night wore on. The wind dropped completely, leaving the border woods silent and clear. "What are you going to do?" Mara asked, staring out at the dark tree line. "Eravast knows, doesn't he?" "Eravast suspects," Caelindor replied softly. "He noticed my absence from the High Council 3 weeks ago. He has sent his scouts to the border posts." "If he finds out about the child," Mara said, her voice trembling slightly for the first time that night, "he will bring the court guards. He will claim the child under your own law." "He will try," Caelindor said. "You cannot fight your own court, Cael," Mara said, leaning forward, her blanket slipping from her shoulder. "You are the king, but you are not absolute. If the High Council votes against you, if they declare the child a ward of the crown under the 3rd edict—" "I am going to dissolve the law," he interrupted. Mara stared at the back of his silver head. "You can't just dissolve a 300-year-old edict. The council will declare you unfit. They will invoke the regency." "I wrote the law," Caelindor repeated quietly. He turned his head and looked up at her from his seat on the step. His pale gold eyes were steady, but beneath the golden light lay a deep, ancient well of regret. "Do you know why I wrote it, Mara?" Mara shook her head silently. Caelindor turned back to the dark yard. He set the steaming mug of tea down on the frost-dusted wooden step beside his boot. 312 years ago, he said, his voice dropping into that low, vibrating resonance that sounded like ancient water moving over stone. I met a woman, a human woman. Her name was Hannah. Mara's breath hitched in her chest. She had known there was a history. She had seen the parchment in the archive. But hearing him speak the name of a mortal woman in his cold, perfect voice made something twist sharply in her stomach. She lived in the Western Marches, Caelindor continued, his tone devoid of melodrama, flat with the weight of truth. I was young, only 1100 years old. I thought I could have both. I thought I could be the High King in the Reach and a man in her cabin. He reached out and picked up a dry fir cone from the step, turning it over in his long fingers. She became pregnant, he said. I did not know. I was called away to the northern border to settle a dispute with the frost dwarves. It took me 4 months to return. He paused. The quiet in the yard was absolute. When I arrived at her cottage, she was dead, he said simply. She had died in childbed 3 days before. And the court, my court, led by Eravast's father, had already come. Mara pressed her back against the wooden wall of the house, her hand clutching her stomach. They took the child, Caelindor whispered. A boy. They brought him to the Reach. They told me it was for his protection, that a half-human infant could not survive in a muddy human village without elven magic to sustain his core. He squeezed his hand closed. The dry fir cone crumbled into dust between his pale fingers. They brought him to the sanctum. But they did not know how to love him, Mara. They fed him starlight milk and bathed him in enchanted water, but they never held him against their skin. They looked upon him as a curiosity, a dangerous, half-blooded anomaly. He looked up at the cold stars above the cottage roof. He died when he was 6 months old, Caelindor said. He simply stopped breathing. His heart was too fragile for the stone halls. Mara felt a tear slip down her cheek, hot and fast, cutting through the dirt on her skin. After he died, Caelindor said, I wrote the third edict. I decreed that any child of elven blood born outside the court was the property of the crown. I told myself I was protecting them. I told myself that no elven child would ever be left to die in a cold human hut, that I would bring them all into the Reach, where they could be guarded, fed, and preserved. He turned his head and looked at her. I was wrong, he said. I built a cage, Mara. I built a magnificent stone cage because I was too terrified to face my own grief. Mara leaned down from her bench. She reached out and touched his shoulder. His velvet cloak was freezing, but through the heavy cloth, she felt the rigid, shaking tension in his frame. That is not what the law does now, Cael, she said softly. It doesn't protect children. It steals them. I know, Caelindor said. He covered her hand with his own cold, pale fingers. And that is why I am going to break it. Dawn came with the color of bruised plums. Mara had slept for only 2 hours, sitting upright on her wooden bench with Caelindor sitting vigil on the step below. Her back was a wall of searing pain, and a strange, tight cramping had begun low in her pelvis, a sensation that tightened her stomach into a hard knot every 20 minutes. She said nothing to him about the cramps. She did not want him to panic. As the first thin rays of gray light filtered through the ironwood trees, the silence of the village was broken by the sound of iron-shod hooves. Not one horse, 6. Caelindor stood up instantly. The movement was so fast Mara barely saw it happen. 1 second he was sitting on the step, the next he was standing in the middle of her yard, his tall frame drawn up to its full, terrifying height, his silver hair catching the gray morning light. 6 elven riders broke through the tree line at the edge of the village. They were dressed in silver and black scale mail, their long cloaks bearing the crest of the High Council, a silver oak encircled by 3 iron rings. At their head rode an elven herald, a tall, gaunt male with hair the color of bone, holding a rolled scroll bound with red wax. Lord Aravast had not come himself. He was too clever for that. He had sent the crown guards. Behind them, at a safe distance, a dozen Ashford villagers had emerged from their huts. Bren was there, holding his heavy iron pitchfork, flanked by the village blacksmith and 2 young farmhands armed with wood axes. They looked terrified, their faces pale in the dawn light, but they stood their ground at the edge of the track. The herald pulled his horse to a halt 30 feet from Mara's door. His pale eyes swept over the humble cottage, the muddy garden patch, the group of ragged human villagers, and finally rested on Caelindor. The herald dismounted, taking 3 measured steps forward before kneeling on one knee. "My lord king," the herald said in High Elvish, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet yard. "The High Council has observed your absence. Lord Aravast has dispatched us with a formal writ of reclamation." Caelindor did not move an inch. His expression was a wall of absolute ice. "You are far from the reach, herald," Caelindor said in his native tongue. His voice did not sound human at all now. It was a deep, resonant rumble that made the ground beneath Mara's boots vibrate faintly. The herald stood up, unrolling the parchment scroll. "By order of the High Council and the 3rd Edict of the First House," the herald read aloud, his voice metallic and unfeeling. "It has been reported that a child bearing the royal bloodline of the Reach is to be birthed within this border settlement. We are commanded to take custody of the mother and the unborn infant to ensure the preservation of the royal succession." Mara took a slow step backward until her spine hit the wooden doorframe of her cottage. A sudden, vicious contraction seized her lower belly, far harder than the ones before, making her knees buckle. She caught herself on the doorframe, letting out a small, smothered gasp. Caelindor did not look back at her, but his shoulders went rigid. A wave of intense, suffocating cold blasted outward from his frame, frosting the dry grass in a 15-foot circle around his boots. "The king is present," Caelindor said, his voice dropping an octave into a terrifying, lethal quiet. "And the king supersedes the council." "The king wrote the law," the herald replied, his voice showing the first crack of nervousness as he looked at the frost spreading toward his boots. "And under Edict 3, Clause 4, the king cannot unilaterally void a succession law without a full quorum of the High Council. Lord Aravast has already invoked the emergency succession clause. If you resist, my lord, the guards are sworn to enforce the writ." The 6 silver-armored guards behind the herald reached for the hilts of their long, curved blades. Across the yard, Bren raised his pitchfork, his face set in a furious, terrified mask. "Leave her be!" Bren shouted in the trade tongue, stepping forward. "She's our healer! You touch her, you pale bastards, and I'll—" "Stand down, Bren!" Mara called out, her voice raw as another wave of pain ripped through her abdomen. "Stay back!" Caelindor took 1 step toward the herald. The air in the yard seemed to warp around him.
The faint gold light in his eyes flared into a blinding, brilliant topaz glare.
Touch her,
Caelindor whispered, the sound vibrating through the bones of every man in the yard. And I will tear the gates of the Reach off their hinges and burn the High Council chamber to ash. The 6 guards froze. Not one of them drew their blade. They were elite soldiers of the royal guard, but they were looking at their king, a 1,400-year-old immortal whose magic was older than their entire city. Cael, Mara gasped, grabbing her stomach with both hands as a hot gush of liquid soaked through her woolen skirt and ran down her legs. Her water had broken. Caelindor turned instantly. The lethal aura vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror as he saw her swaying against the doorframe, her face deathly pale, sweat glistening on her forehead. He was across the yard in a heartbeat, catching her under her arms before her knees hit the porch boards. "Mara," he breathed, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "Mara, what is it?"
"The baby," she choked out, her head falling back against his shoulder. It's coming. Now."
The herald took a step forward, his scroll still held out. "My lord, the writ demands—"
"If you take another step toward this house," Caelindor said without looking back, his voice thick with a terrifying, quiet fury, "I will kill you where you stand."
He carried her inside the cottage, kicking the heavy oak door shut behind them with his boot. The next 6 hours were a blur of pain, cold sweat, and the smell of boiled water and copper. Mara lay on her narrow bed, her teeth grinding together so hard her jaw bled. The contractions were relentless, coming one after another like waves crashing against a cliff face. Caelindor was entirely useless as a healer. The king who had ruled 300,000 elves sat on the edge of her wooden bed, looking completely lost, holding her small, sweating hand between both of his large, ice-cold palms.
"Tell me what to do,"
he begged softly, his pale gold eyes wide with a frantic, helpless panic she had never seen in him before.
"Mara, tell me what to do. I do not know how to do this."
Boil the water," she gasped out, her fingers digging so hard into his knuckles she felt his bone press against her skin. Clean linen, on the table." A loud knock echoed against the front door. Caelindor's head snapped toward the entrance, his face darkening instantly. He began to stand, his hand reaching for the invisible current of his magic, but before he could move, the latch lifted. A woman walked into the cottage. She was an elf, tall, slender, with dark brown hair braided tightly around her crown and eyes the color of polished slate. She wore a simple traveling cloak of deep green wool, spattered with mud around the hem. "Sylvain." Caelindor froze. "Sylvain? You move too fast for an old woman, Caelindor," Sylvain said, her voice dry, brisk, and entirely unbothered by the king's lethal glare. She dropped her heavy leather saddlebags onto the pine table and unpinned her cloak. "Eravast's herald is standing in the yard looking like he has swallowed a toad. Your human neighbors are preparing to assault 6 court guards with pitchforks and wood axes." She walked straight to the bed, pushing Caelindor out of the way with a firm shove of her shoulder. "Get out of my way, boy," Sylvain snapped at the 1,400-year-old monarch. "I have delivered 84 elven infants and 30 human ones, while you were busy writing stupid laws." She looked down at Mara, her dark slate eyes softening slightly as she took in Mara's pale, exhausted face and sweating forehead. "You must be Mara," Sylvain said softly, placing a cool, firm hand on Mara's rounded stomach. "I am Sylvain, Caelindor's advisor, and the only person in the Reach who has enough sense to tell him when he is being an idiot." Mara let out a ragged laugh that turned into a gasp as another contraction hit. "Please." "I know, child," Sylvain said gently, stripping back the heavy wool blankets. She looked over her shoulder at Caelindor, who was standing 6 feet away, looking like a tall, pale ghost. Caelindor, go outside. No, Caelindor said instantly. I am remaining. You are in the way, Sylvain said flatly. Go stand in the doorway and make sure Aravast's herald does not try to cross the threshold. I am invoking the first priority law. Caelindor stopped. The first priority? The ancient maternal right, Sylvain said, turning her attention back to Mara. Decreed by the High Queen 4,000 years ago, long before your foolish third edict. No child of elven blood may be separated from its mother within the first hour of life, under any circumstance, for any legal claim. Even a king's writ cannot breach it. She glared at Caelindor until he slowly nodded, turned, and walked to the front door, positioning his tall frame directly in front of the latched wood, like a living shield. The birth was hard. For 3 more hours, Mara labored in the dim firelight of her small cottage, surrounded by the smell of crushed, dried lavender that Sylvain had thrown into the hearth fire to sweeten the air. Sylvain was methodical, gentle, and utterly ruthless. She talked Mara through every push, her ancient voice steady as stone, guiding Mara's hands, wiping her forehead with cool, wet linen. At midday, with a final, agonizing push that made Mara scream until her vocal cords tore, the child entered the world. A sharp, thin cry rang out through the small room, high, clear, and furious. Sylvain caught the infant in a warm wool towel. She worked quickly, clearing the child's nose and mouth, tying the cord with silk thread before wrapping the baby securely in clean white linen. A girl, Sylvain whispered, a rare, soft smile breaking across her old face. A strong, loud girl. Mara collapsed back onto her blood-stained pillows, her chest heaving, her vision blurring at the edges. Is she... Sylvain brought the bundle over and laid the baby gently on Mara's bare chest. Mara looked down through her tears. The baby was small, her skin a soft, rosy pink. On her tiny head was a thick tuft of auburn hair, just like Mara's, but running straight through the center was a single, brilliant streak of silver white. Slowly, the baby opened her eyes. They were not blue, like human infants. They were a brilliant, clear, silver gray, glowing with a soft, steady inner light. And as Mara gently brushed back the tiny lock of silver hair, she saw it. The faint, delicate point at the tip of her small ears. Ember, Mara whispered, her fingers trembling as she touched the baby's tiny, soft cheek. Her name is Ember. The door opened slowly. Caelindor walked in. He looked battered, not by weapons, but by the sheer emotional weight of the hours he had spent standing outside listening to her pain. He stopped at the foot of the bed. Mara looked up at him. She did not say a word. She simply shifted her arm, holding the white bundle higher so he could see. Caelindor walked forward, as if approaching an altar. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his long legs folding onto the dusty pine floorboards. He looked at his daughter. The pale gold light in his eyes flickered, softened, and then dissolved completely into quiet, unshed tears. His hand, large, powerful, capable of destroying kingdoms, rose slowly. With extraordinary care, his long index finger touched the baby's tiny, open palm. The baby's fingers curled instantly around his nail, holding on with the ferocious strength of a newborn. Caelindor let out a low, shuddering breath, his head dropping forward until his forehead rested against Mara's arm,
his shoulders shaking silently in the cold room. 10 minutes later, the Silver King stood on the front porch of the cottage. He had not put on his dark velvet cloak. He stood in his simple gray wool tunic, his silver hair wind-blown, his boots covered in muddy earth. In the yard, Erebost's herald sat on his white horse, surrounded by the 6 silver-armored guards. Bren and the villagers still stood at the edge of the track, watching intently. Sylvain stood on the porch step beside Caelindor, holding a heavy iron key in her hand. The herald cleared his throat, holding up the scroll. "My Lord King, the hour has passed. Under the 3rd edict..." Caelindor looked at the herald. He did not raise his voice. He did not call upon his magic to shock or terrify. He spoke in High Elvish, his voice carrying with absolute, crystalline clarity across the quiet border village. "I, Caelindor, first of the House of Silver, High King of the Great Reach, invoke the King's absolute prerogative," he said. The herald's face went dead white. The scroll in his hand trembled. "My lord, you cannot." "I speak it at the sight of the law's violation," Caelindor continued, his tone cold, ancient, and unbreakable. "Before 2 witnesses of the first house and the people of this land. The 3rd edict of the High Court is hereby dissolved, null, void, erased from the parchment of the Reach from this moment until the end of days." He looked at the herald. "No child bearing elven blood shall ever be taken from its mother again," Caelindor said. "Go back to the Reach, herald. Tell Lord Erebast that his law is dust. And tell him that if he wishes to challenge my decree, he may meet me in the High Chamber in 7 days." The herald stared at the king for a long, silent moment. He looked at Sylvain, who gave him a single, stern nod of confirmation. He looked at the 6 court guards, whose heads were already bowed in absolute submission to their king's prerogative. Slowly, the herald rolled up the parchment, turned his horse, and rode away into the ironwood forest. The 6 guards followed him without a word. Bren stepped forward from the edge of the track, his heavy iron pitchfork lowering to the dirt. He looked at Caelindor, then at the open cottage door where Mara lay with her child. "He's staying, isn't he?" Bren asked Sylvain quietly. Sylvain looked at the tall king standing on the wooden porch, his gaze already turning back toward the quiet room inside. "Yes, Miller," Sylvain said softly. "I believe he is." 3 days later, the cottage smelled of pine smoke, warm milk, and dried lavender. The hearth fire burned bright and hot, casting a deep amber glow across the pine floorboards. Outside, a soft, late autumn rain was falling, tapping gently against the glass panes of the narrow window. Caelindor sat on the low wooden stool beside the hearth, a small iron hatchet in his lap. He had spent the morning fixing the front door. The heavy oak plank that had stuck in its frame for 3 years now swung smoothly and silently on its hinges, lubricated with mutton tallow he had borrowed from Bren. He had also repaired the shutter on the east window that let in the wind, stacked 2 cords of birch logs under the lean-to shed, and cleared the dead cabbage stalks from her garden patch. He did not ask if he could stay. He simply remained, quiet, watchful, and present, moving around her small home with a slow, careful reverence. Mara lay on her bed, propped up on 3 thick wool pillows, watching him. Ember was asleep on her chest, wrapped in a soft flannel blanket, her tiny, silver-streaked head rising and falling with Mara's steady breathing. "You are going to have to go back to the Reach in 4 days," Mara said quietly into the warm room. Caelindor set the hatchet down on the stone hearth. He stood up, his tall frame folding as he walked across the pine boards and sat on the edge of her bed. I will go to the high chamber, he agreed softly. I will address the council. I will ensure the dissolution of the law is recorded in the great register. He looked down at her face. And then I will return.
Cael, Mara said, her voice direct and unvarnished. You are a king. I am a healer in a muddy border village. I cannot live in your stone palace. I will not raise Ember in a place where people look at her as a curiosity.
I know, Caelindor said. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the small, crumpled piece of parchment, the note she had left on his pillow 8 months ago. Navanta lost. Do not forget me. I spent 300 years believing that protection meant isolation, he said, his pale gold eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I thought that if I kept everything behind stone walls, my heart, my kingdom, my law, nothing could ever be broken again. He touched the edge of the parchment with his thumb. I was wrong, he whispered. The stone cage did not protect me, Mara. It merely kept me cold. He looked down at Ember, whose tiny hand had uncurled from the blanket, resting against Mara's collarbone. I will build a house, Caelindor said. Here, on the border, half in the Reach, half in Ashford. I will rule my court 3 days a week, and I will chop your firewood for the other 4. Mara stared at him, a dry, incredulous laugh escaping her throat. The Silver King, chopping wood for a human healer. The Silver King was a foolish lawgiver who let his heart freeze, Caelindor said gently. I am done being him. He reached out, his long, pale fingers sliding gently over her cheek, his skin warm and static-charged against hers. What did you mean? He asked softly, pointing to the 3 words written on the yellowed parchment. When you wrote this. Mara looked into his gold eyes, at the light that was no longer cold stone, but warm, steady, and quiet as a hearth fire. You know what it means, she whispered. I know the translation, he said, his thumb smoothing over her cheekbone. I want to hear you say it. Mara leaned her head into his palm, her fingers rising to cover his cold knuckles. I meant, she said, her voice clear and permanent in the quiet, firelit room, that I left a piece of myself in your archive room, and I knew I would never get it back. Caelindor leaned down. He did not kiss her mouth. He pressed his forehead gently against hers, his silver hair falling around her face like a curtain, shielding them and their child from the rest of the world. I spent 5 months learning not to be afraid of what that meant to me, Caelindor whispered against her skin. I failed. Outside, the rain fell softly on the thatch, washing away the frost of the long night. Inside, by the warm pine fire, the Silver King sat in a human healer's cottage, holding his daughter's hand, with nowhere else in the world he wished to be.